and the assumption that she was just a file clerk because she was a woman and black. He turned back to his table, muttering half under his breath, "I thought I was dealing with court staff today, not janitorial services." Delaney heard, but didn't react. She walked to the side desk where the case file had been placed and opened it. Outside, no one noticed. Inside, the chill was beginning to rise. Reese grew impatient. He moved closer. "Hey, I'm talking to you. Which side are you on, defense, or just here to take notes?" Delaney remained silent. She read, "You deaf or something? Or do people like you sit there like statues?" Some heads began to turn. They saw his tone, but they didn't interfere because this was too familiar. Reese stepped even closer. "I don't have time for the silent treatment from some black lady who thinks she's important." And then the slap landed. No one moved in time. No one expected it. A slap is not just aimed at the cheek of a woman. It struck her skin. It struck her presence. It hit the very confidence he believed she wasn't allowed to have. The room was crowded, but fell silent like a blank page. A pen dropped. A gasp was heard. A young lawyer froze, stunned. Only she remained still. She didn't touch her face, didn't blink, didn't rage. She turned her head. And those eyes, those of someone who had endured 1,000 dismissals but never bowed, looked directly at Reese. He faltered, confused, as if he had just hit the wrong person. It was as if he had just realized that the slap might have struck the face of the system which he believed would always protect him. Delaney walked up to the bench. No robe, no announcement, the entire room frozen waiting. And for the first time in Reese's life, he began to tremble. Silence is the strangest form of power in a courtroom. It doesn't need yelling or grand gestures. It only needs to last long enough for people to feel its weight. And that morning, after being slapped by a police officer in open court, Justice Delaney chose silence. Not because she was powerless, but because she knew the one who raised his hand had revealed himself to the world. She ascended the bench, no panic, no rush, no robe on her shoulders, but every step carried a different weight. The room slowly turned. Eyes wide, Reese stood frozen. His hand was still suspended mid-air, not knowing what to do with it. Court clerks began whispering. A young reporter quietly switched on their recorder. A man at the back of the room started to feel afraid. Delaney sat, placed both hands on the wooden desk and lifted her head to meet Reese's gaze. She didn't shout. She asked, voice steady as steel, "Sergeant Reese, did you just strike me?" Reese stammered. His mouth moved. I didn't know who you were. I didn't ask if you knew who I was. I asked, did you just hit a woman in a courtroom without provocation? Simple question, yes or no. A quiet cough from the gallery. A juror pulled out their phone. The red light of the security camera blinked above. Reese looked around, searching for an ally. No one met his eyes. Even his fellow officer in the corner turned away. "I thought she was with the defendant," he muttered, voice lower now. "She wasn't in a robe, no badge. I didn't ask who you thought I was. I asked, do you think hitting someone without cause in a place that represents the law is justifiable?" Reese said nothing. He was cornered, and at that moment all the masks fell. Justice Delaney stood, calm as a lake that had just caught a thunderbolt without rippling. "If today I were a white man, wore a three-piece suit, sat at the bench introduced with the title, would you have raised your hand?" Reese had no answer, and that silence became his most extraordinary confession. Delaney turned to the clerk. "Record in the minutes, Officer Logan Reese has admitted to assaulting a judicial officer, a judge, during an open session. Clarify no provocation, threat, or justification beyond a mistaken assumption rooted in personal bias." Then she looked back at Reese, and for the first time let anger sharpen her voice. You didn't hit me because I did anything wrong. You hit me because I stood still without fearing you, because I had a skin color you assumed meant subordinate, because I was a woman and you thought I wouldn't respond." Reese shifted, his lips tightened, jaw clenched. "I was doing my job." "That kid is a thug. I caught him." Delaney raised her hand. "Cut him off. You do not get to hit people because you're irritated. And you do not get to strike someone whose identity you didn't even confirm simply because their skin color offended your eyes. This is not a misunderstanding. This is systemic abuse of power, and today it just unmasked itself." The room held its breath. Only the sound of the recorder, the hum of the AC, the slow realization spreading through every gaze, things would never be the same. Delaney tapped the gavel gently. "Sergeant Reese, until a formal investigation is complete, you are placed under immediate in-court detention. You are not to leave this room, not to approach any witness, not to contact anyone outside your legal counsel. This is justice, not a sheriff's decree, not a family legacy, not a skin color, just the law. And I am here to enforce it." She turned to another officer. "Mills, lock the courtroom doors and review all security footage. I want every frame submitted to the Department of Justice by this evening." Sergeant Reese sat down, back soaked in sweat, eyes fixed on the small wooden gavel. He had laughed before at equality under the law. Today he was forced to feel it from below for the first time. Some court days go by like any other records, motions, and debate. And then there are days like today, where no verdict is read, but the entire system feels as if it just stood trial. After Reese was ordered to remain seated, the courtroom fell into another kind of silence, not the kind born of shock, but of realization something grave had just been exposed. Justice Delaney did not return to her seat. She stood tall, stepping forward from the bench, one hand resting gently on the wooden table as if to steady the room which now tilted dangerously toward disorder. She looked down at the teenager huddled on the defendant's bench, his eyes asking, "Is she a judge?" She gave the faintest nod. She didn't speak. But he understood. Today, no one would blame him. Delaney turned to the clerk. "Enter into the record, the defendant's hearing is postponed until tomorrow. The violent conduct of the arresting officer has compromised the integrity of this morning's session." The public defender nodded, eyes still rimmed red. The boy bowed his head, not in shame, but because someone had stood up for him for the first time, without demanding that he apologize. Delaney looked up at her gaze locking on Reese, the man who had once commanded the room with his voice stance and the badge over his chest. Now he sat rigid, fists clenched, lips tight. His swagger was gone. She asked slowly with no need to raise her voice, "How long have you served, Sergeant Reese?" "More than 20 years. "And in those 20 years, were you ever disciplined?" "No," he answered, but his eyes darted. Delaney sat down. "That's strange, because I recall reading your name at least 5 times in the past 3 years. The room stirred. Reese opened his mouth, but she pulled a thin folder from the court drawer, a beige cover marked in red pen. Civilian complaints for excessive force. 3 internal reports were all resolved internally. 1 missing body cam in the arrest of a 15-year-old in Westbrook. Did you think I didn't know, Sergeant?" Sweat visibly formed on Reese's brow. He tried to say something, but only managed, "I didn't do anything wrong." Delaney laid the folder down. Her eyes are sharper than steel. "The problem isn't what you did wrong. The problem is every time you did something wrong, someone cleaned up after you." The room fell silent again. This was no longer just an assault. This was the beginning of unraveling something deeper. Delaney turned to one of the 2 officers observing from the gallery. The man nodded ever so slightly. He said nothing, but his face no longer trusted Reese. The clerk leaned in, whispering, "Ma'am, should we notify Internal Affairs?" Delaney didn't hesitate. "No, I'm sending this straight to the U.S. Department of Justice. This isn't just Charleston's problem anymore." Everyone in the room understood by then Justice Delaney wasn't just judging Reese. She was judging the entire system that made him believe he was untouchable. Reese lowered his head, not out of remorse, but because he knew no one was left to hide behind this time. No one left to call, no one left to cover for him. And Justice Delaney was once labeled the gentle judge who never rocked the boat. Today, she was the storm. Justice doesn't knock politely on the doors of power. It arrives. As a warning, after the session was adjourned that afternoon, Justice Delaney returned to her chambers. She didn't go home. The courthouse was empty now, but her office light still glowed. Her window faced Broad Street. A drizzle fell. The desk phone rang. The display showed an internal number, but there was no name. She picked up. A man's voice was low, polite, but every word cut like a blade. "Judge Delaney, I think you've stirred up enough trouble for one morning." She recognized the voice, the federal chief judge for the Charleston district. A man who once called her the pride of the judiciary back when she didn't ruffle feathers. Now his tone held no praise. "I've been told you ordered the detainment of a police officer in court." "No," Delaney replied, voice steady. "I ordered the investigation of a crime committed in broad daylight in what's supposed to be a sanctuary of the law." Silence on the other end. "You're setting a dangerous precedent, Delaney. The media is already buzzing. I've received 3 calls from the mayor's office, 2 from the police board. They're not happy." "I wasn't appointed to keep them happy," she said firmly. "Careful, Delaney. When people aren't happy, they start digging." The call ended. No threats were spoken, but she understood the message. Stay silent or be excavated. The 3 days later, social media exploded with a post from an anonymous account. Judge Justice Delaney showed bias in a 2009 case, linked to radical activist groups. No evidence, no sources, just kindling, and someone was ready to fan the flames. An old doctored photo spread quickly, Delaney fist raised at a protest in the 1990s. The photo itself was real, but the caption, "Activist in judge's robes," on TV pundits repeated the same question. Can someone with left-leaning ideology like Delaney be truly impartial from the bench? Carter, her longtime clerk at her office, closed his laptop after reading all the reports. He walked to her desk, placed a printed copy in front of her. "You should see this." Delaney skimmed it. Her expression didn't change. Carter lowered his voice. "They're building a reverse dossier, piece by piece. I bet the Judicial Ethics Board will show up next." Delaney set the page down. "Good. I hope they do." "Aren't you afraid?" Carter asked. She shook her head. "I used to be back when I thought silence was how you survive. Now I know survival isn't existence. Existence is making sure others can't pretend you don't." When she returned home that night, she found an envelope beneath the doormat. No address, no sender. Inside was a photo of her grandson, Miles, age 11, riding his bike home from school. On the back in red ink, "Stay in your lane. Don't stir the pot." Delaney stood still in the hallway. She wasn't afraid. She was angry, not because they targeted her, but because they believed she'd back down for her family's sake. The next morning, she sent a formal request to the Department of Justice launch an independent federal investigation into all cases involving Officer Reese over the past 10 years. No detours, no intermediaries, just one final line at the bottom. When a system fails to purge itself, it must be dismantled from the rot within. Justice Delaney didn't scream. She didn't go on TV to refute. She let the truth do its work. And that terrified them more than any threat ever could. Truth doesn't arrive with sirens. It seeps through like a leak in the ceiling, quiet, persistent. And if you wait long enough, it reveals a whole floor that's already rotten. The following morning, in a closed-door meeting at the federal building in Charleston, Justice Delaney met two familiar names from her days as a prosecutor. Agent Rosalind Keene, a middle-aged black woman, was known not for her voice, but for internal reports that gave people sleepless nights. And Agent Felix Reyes, Latino, younger, razor-sharp eyes like blades that had never dulled. No pleasantries, no coffee, just a USB stick and a printout labeled Boone, Travis Level 2 Surveillance, Case File D109. Reyes began, "We've been monitoring Reese for 4 years now, but his files always came back clean, neat, airtight." Keene added, "You're the first breakthrough we didn't have to manufacture. All we had to do was hit record and wait for him to tear off his mask." Delaney showed no emotion. She replied, "He didn't tear off the mask. He believed he didn't need one." Keene nodded. "Then I pulled up a slide. It listed dismissed cases all tossed for lack of evidence. Everyone had 3 things in common. Defendants were people of color, mostly under 25. Arresting officer Travis Reese, prosecutor Carson Mercer." Delaney frowned. Carson Mercer was once her former student at the Law Academy. A talented prosecutor, smooth-talking, praised for quick, clean convictions. Now she understood why he closed cases so fast. Reyes continued, "We also found 2 missing body cam recordings. One had a temporary backup stored by a technician who was then transferred out of state." Keene handed her a photocopy, an anonymous internal statement. "I once saw Reese being handed a gift by an ADA after he handled a tough case. I also heard Mercer say once, 'Reese knows how to clean trash without leaving a smell.'" Justice Delaney laid the printout down. "We're not just facing one rogue officer, we're facing a system that's learned how to erase its tracks. And what's most terrifying, it does it as routine without needing orders." The conference room door closed behind a newly arrived FBI agent. He placed a city map on the table. Red, blue, and yellow pins marked arrest locations, handling agencies, number of complaints. All converged into a disturbingly familiar shape, Charleston's communities of color. Keene lowered her voice. "Are you sure you want to keep going?" Delaney stared at the chart. "If I stop here, then he'll never again be able to stand before the law students I once taught. He'll never be able to look my grandson in the eye. And worst of all, he'll have become part of the leaking ceiling." At 3:30 p.m. that afternoon, Delaney sent a formal request to the Department of Justice. "I propose freezing all criminal records related to Sergeant Reese over the past 10 years and sealing the internal server of the Charleston prosecutor's office." 8 minutes later, her phone buzzed. It was Carson Mercer. His tone was gentle, polished. "Delaney, this morning. You may have gone too far." "I only did my duty," she replied. "Some things weren't meant to be exposed." "You're worried enough to call me Carson. Just a reminder, Judge, no one pokes at the foundation and walks away uncrushed." Delaney smiled. "I'm not destroying the foundation, I'm clearing the trash, so that what's truly solid can still stand." She hung up. No trembling hands. No doubt, because for the first time in years, Justice Delaney didn't feel alone. Truth was beginning to take form, and it was learning how to stand. There are trials where the accused never enters the dock. They sit in the gallery, neckties, uniforms, titles for shields. And then with the right testimony, that whole row becomes the jury of its complicity. That morning, the federal courtroom was packed. Press filled the back. Television cameras lined both aisles. Even law students were issued temporary badges to observe. Sergeant Reese sat at the defendant's table, grey suit tight across tense shoulders. Behind him, a team of defense attorneys. But none looked confident about how the day would go. When the name Justice Delaney was called to the stand, the room dropped into an unusual silence, not of fear, but reverence. And curiosity, what would this woman say about the very system she once served? She rose, no robe, no notes, just bright eyes, a straight spine, and steady hands. She took the oath, sat, faced the prosecutor. "Judge Delaney," the prosecutor began, "can you recount what happened on the morning of April 11th in the Charleston courthouse?" Justice Delaney answered, her voice low, but each word clear. "I was struck. Not because I did something wrong. Not because I threatened anyone, but because I was a black woman, with no visible signs of authority. And in Sergeant Reese's eyes that meant undeserving of respect." A wave of tension rolled through the press row, cameras adjusted. Reese looked down, jaw clenched. "I'm not speaking today because I was a victim," she continued. "I speak because I was a witness to hundreds of cases over the years where people like brown-skinned, poor, undereducated were presumed guilty the moment they walked into court. I used to think staying silent was protecting objectivity. But I was wrong. Silence is never neutral. Silence is educated complicity." A female law student in the back began to cry. A public defender straightened her back. A young officer turned to his partner and lowered his head. The defense attorney stood up, voice slightly shaky. "Judge Delaney, are you bringing personal bias into this hearing? Are you turning it into a social crusade?" Delaney didn't respond immediately. She looked directly into the lawyer's eyes. "I bring no bias. I bring truth. If the truth makes people uncomfortable, that's not my fault. That's a sign. The system's gotten too used to comfort." The room remained silent. No gavel was banged. No one interrupted. Because at that moment, everyone knew this wasn't just testimony. This was the first verdict for those who'd never been on trial. When the hearing recessed, reporters flooded the hall. One journalist rushed up to her. "Judge Delaney, do you think your testimony will change anything?" She stopped, didn't smile, didn't flinch. "I don't know, but I know this: if we don't speak, someone else will rewrite the truth, with the words of the powerful." Justice Delaney left the courtroom. Grey blouse, low heels, hair in a neat bun. No bodyguards, no clerk, just her shadow stretching long across the marble floor. And the aftershock of the silence she had just shattered. The cost of telling the truth isn't the loss of reputation. It's watching the ones who once smiled at you turn into knives. 3 days after Justice Delaney took the stand, the backlash began, not from defense attorneys, not from police, but from the media. Across news channels, anonymous blogs, and social commentary, the exact phrases began to circulate: "biased judge." Delaney faced an ethics complaint in 2009. A political activist masquerading as a judge. No evidence, no verification. But that wasn't the point. They just needed to sow doubt. One viral post showed a black-and-white photo of Delaney as a law student, marching in a protest against racial injustice. The photo was real, but the caption twisted it: "Judge who once marched against the government, can she truly be impartial?" Meanwhile, a newly created social media account, seemingly real, began posting vague, suggestive anecdotes on repeat. A friend who used to work with Delaney told me she was too emotional on the bench, always sided with the community. The community. The word itself wasn't wrong, but it became an accusation in the mouths of those who despised her. Carter, her longtime clerk, closed his laptop and turned to her. "They've started, and they're not playing fair." Delaney continued reading through the Reese files. She didn't look up, just said, "I'm not playing to be fair, I'm playing to clean house." When she arrived home that night, there was a package without a name on the porch. Inside was a photo. Her grandson, Miles, age 11, rides his bike home from school. The photo was taken from a distance, clearly surveillance. On the back, scribbled in red ink, "Know your place, or see what the boy pays." Delaney didn't panic. She stood still in her living room, holding the photo, then called Carter. "I need you to pull Miles out of school, move my sister somewhere safe. Don't notify local police. We no longer know who's who." Carter asked only one question, "And you?" Delaney looked out the window where the city lights still gleamed, as if nothing had happened. "I stay. Because if I leave, he'll stand in my place." The next morning, Delaney met again with agents Keene and Reyes. On the table, a map connecting Reese Mercer and 3 new names: a senior detective, an assistant prosecutor, and a retired federal judge, once Delaney's academic mentor. Reyes spoke. "This isn't a string of isolated cases, it's a network. Each person is tied to evidence suppression, tampering, or deliberate leniency." Delaney didn't flinch. She just exhaled slowly. "I studied under one of those men. I once thought he opened the doors for black women in law." Keene paused, then asked, "You want to bring this all to light?" Delaney nodded. "Not just light. If it was built on silence, I want to burn the house down." Hours later, she held a press conference. Not in court, not as a judge, just as a citizen. She stood behind an old wooden podium, the mic crackling. A breeze stirred the air. Dozens of reporters in front. A few citizens in the back held signs, "Justice Delaney speaks for us." She said, "I'm not here to ask for your trust. I'm here to ask what is the worth of our legal system if its guardians are threatened for doing what's right. I've been smeared, my family's been watched, but I haven't walked away, because I know if I step back, no one else will dare to step forward." The crowd fell silent. Then the first clap came from an older woman, then a young student, then the crowd. And for the first time, Justice Delaney was not alone. Justice doesn't arrive with flashbulbs and applause. It comes quietly, like a breath held too long, finally exhaled. On a Monday morning, Justice Delaney officially submitted her resignation at the South Carolina State Government Building, not because she lost, not because she was forced out, but because she knew some battles must be fought beyond the courtroom. Not with gavels, but with truth printed, bound, and dropped like charges into the system. She laid a thick dossier on the table in a closed-door meeting with DOJ officials. Each page a dubious conviction, a body cam video lost, then found, a redacted witness statement. A celebrated public servant's name is now evidence of deceit. A federal prosecutor flipped through the pages, eyes widening. "Judge Delaney, if this is real, then this isn't a few bad cases. This is," she cut in, "this is a system. A machine greased by silence, protected by favors, and fueled by compromise." That same day, a federal investigation was launched. Codename Clean Gavel. That evening, Justice Delaney returned home. Mount Pleasant's streets were quiet, but she knew the ground was trembling beneath the calm. Miles, her grandson, rode home from school, stopped in the driveway, removed his helmet, and asked, "Auntie, they said you gave up. Is that true?" She sat beside him, eyes steady. "I didn't give up. I just passed the gavel to someone else. And now, I carry the torch. 3 days later, a special hearing was convened at the state capitol. No longer about Reese, no longer about Charleston. Not everyone who gets hit is a victim, and not every slap is aimed at a face. Some slaps are meant for an entire system they believe will never strike back. Monday morning, Charleston's sky was overcast, but there was no rain. The city still held onto its outer charm: red brick homes, wrought iron balconies, and steps so clean they looked painted on. But anyone who had lived here long enough knew the beauty of Charleston was only surface deep. Underneath, prejudice had never truly gone away, but enough that those still seated began to shrink in their chairs. Later that week, national news reported 13 prosecutors suspended, 5 judges under ethics review, Charleston police under federal supervision. Delaney didn't celebrate. She looked at the list, picked up a red pen, marked each reopened case, one by one, not for revenge, but so someone finally hears the words, "We were wrong." Days later, South Carolina law students hosted a public forum, The Legacy of Truth Lessons from Justice Delaney. A female student took the mic. "I used to think the law belonged to those who spoke best. Now I understand the law needs those who speak up. When silence becomes routine." The hall erupted in applause. From backstage, Delaney stood, not stepping out, not accepting honors, just nodding quietly. Because true legacy isn't carved into plaques, it lives in the voices that rise after yours fall silent. Some people end their chapters with thunderous applause. Others choose silence so the next voice can rise louder. 3 months after her resignation, Justice Delaney disappeared from the media. No headlines, no interviews, no viral clips. She returned to Mount Pleasant, to a small house with wooden steps and blooming bougainvillea. People still spoke her name not as a pillar, but as part of the foundation. Meanwhile, the system was changing. A new statute was passed: mandatory independent oversight for arrests involving racial profiling. A free legal aid center was founded, the Delaney Center for Justice. Law schools have also introduced a new course, Professional Dissent, a subject for those who break patterns to protect principles. First lecture, Justice Delaney. One day, during a public university hearing, a young student testified about abuse by a campus officer. His voice trembled, but his eyes didn't waver. "I know they'll say I'm overreacting, but if Justice Delaney could be struck in court and still stand, then I can't lower my head either." On campus, a new mural was completed. Grey background. A judge's gavel was cracked at the handle. Below it, the words, "When justice is not defended, those once denied will rise to defend it themselves." One early autumn afternoon, Miles returned home from school, notebook in hand, pages filled with scribbles. On the first page, he had drawn a small but glowing courtroom. No one sat at the bench. But below, people of every color and age were stepping forward. He showed it to her. "Do you think? Could I do it? Be a lawyer?" She nodded, hand on his shoulder. "If you know right from wrong better than most grown-ups, you're ready." At the same time, in the state cabinet chamber, a resolution was passed: rename a high-level judiciary room Delaney Chamber. Not to honor, to remind courts aren't held up by stone. They're upheld by integrity. She didn't attend the unveiling. Instead, she sat on her porch, knitting a scarf for the coming winter. The wind carried sea salt and jasmine. No one called her name. No one needed to. Because the light she left behind had found its way forward. Justice Delaney didn't fall from grace. She didn't retreat in defeat. She stepped back so others could step forward without trembling. Some win with an argument, some win with the law. But the greatest win with resolve, even when no one promises to stand beside them. This was a hearing on the integrity of the entire judicial system. First witness, Justice Delaney. She didn't read from a paper. She didn't look at the mic. She looked each lawmaker in the eye. I used to believe that justice would come if I stayed quiet and fair. But the truth is, justice doesn't know the way. It needs someone to clear the path. And if those guides are afraid of the dark, no one will walk it. When she finished, the chamber rose. Not all. They live in the choices of a new generation. That morning, she received a handwritten letter. Sender Sergeant Reese. The man who once struck her in open court, the man who once believed himself untouchable. The letter read, "I'm not asking for forgiveness, but I need to say, you were right. Not about me, but about what I thought was normal. I was raised in a system that taught me power never needs checking. You made me look again and see nothing inside." She read to the end. No anger, no bitterness, just folded the letter and whispered, "Late, but never too late." That afternoon, she attended a speech at the high school where Miles studied. The topic, "Justice doesn't start in court, it starts with us." A white student stood and said, "We don't need to be judges to do what's right. We need not look away when wrong happens before our eyes." She froze, because it was the very line she'd carried in her heart for 30 years. That night, she and Miles sat on the porch. He asked, "Do you ever regret it, making all that noise?" She smiled, then shook her head. No, because if I'd stayed quiet, others would think so should they. Miles rested his head on her shoulder. "I think I want to be a lawyer someday, but not to win, to make sure someone doesn't lose unfairly." She squeezed his shoulder gently. "Then you've already understood." A week later, a brass plaque was mounted on the door of a new courtroom. Not her name, no portrait, just the inscription, "Justice is not something granted, it is something guarded every day by every person." From above, Charleston glowed in the golden hour. Red rooftops, long roads, children are laughing in the park, and an older woman strolling across the street. No one turned to look. They didn't need to. Because what she left behind was never meant to be seen. It was meant to be lived. Not legacy, not the office, but a quiet belief that we each can be the gatekeepers of justice, if only we're brave enough not to walk past the silence. The central courthouse stood on Broad Street with massive stone pillars and steps that looked like they belonged to a colonial past. At 7:43 a.m., a black woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair tied neatly back wearing a white blouse and black slacks walked through the security gate. No one looked twice. Justice Delaney, a federal judge in this city, didn't care for theatrics. She needed no one to hold doors, no official escort. She was used to walking into rooms where someone like her was never expected to sit at the highest bench. Inside, the morning session hadn't started. It was a minor case, a teenager arrested for graffiti on a warehouse wall. But the arresting officer was a familiar name, Sergeant Logan Reese. White, third-generation cop, broad shoulders, close-cropped hair, eyes that always looked like they came from a battlefield. He stood at the prosecutor's table, arms crossed, his face irritated, as if having to show up here to explain himself over some poor black kid was a personal insult. The boy the accused huddled in the corner, 16, brown-skinned, gaunt face, frightened eyes. Next to him sat a young public defender, clearly overwhelmed by Reese's presence. When Justice Delaney entered the courtroom, no robe assistant or knocking no one recognized her. Reese glanced over, and in that look was a mix of annoyance, contempt. One ordinary morning in Charleston, a city freshly reformed, normal became precious again. No protests, no news vans were parked at the courthouse, only quiet, and a public relearning how to believe in justice. In her small Mount Pleasant home, Justice Delaney rose before sunrise. Fingers calmly tied her hair and poured her tea like every morning. No more television mentions, no more judicial bench. But people remembered, because some names don't need to be etched in stone.